Well, our next and last speaker of the session is Kevin Kwock, who's an LRGF fellow at Columbia University and working in the area of spectroscopy with James Shuck, and he's done a residency at Los Alamos National Laboratory 3 times. All right, Kevin.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Kwock, and today I am going to talk to you about my work as a PhD student, as well as an LRGF fellow throughout my time at Los Alamos National Laboratory. So the talk is titled Nonlinear Optics and Photon Avalanche in Thulium-Doped Nanocrystals, and how we can use them towards environmental sensing in the near field. So this talk will be outside the wheelhouse of many of you individuals, but I like to see this thought that this material can be a wonder material for sensors and diagnostics in the future. So before I begin, what exactly is nonlinear optics and why do we study this? So nonlinear optics can have many applications in things like optical communications, sensing and characterization, as well as imaging and microscopy. And some of these applications are in things like fiber optical cables, where they can transfer billions and billions of bits of information throughout the different continents. Quantum technologies, where you can transduct microwave photons to the visible and vice versa, from the visible to the microwave. Things like optical watermarks to secure your bills, to prevent forgery and counterfeits. And lastly but not least, bioimaging, where you can sort of put these particles inside biological tissue and allow you to image them with infrared excitation, but collecting visible emission. But I also like to say that many applications of nonlinear optics that I've been studying throughout my PhD are enabled by these lanthanides. So if you look at the elements that sit next to the different application technologies and application areas, they're all lanthanides, and they're all what enable these application nonlinear optics that I've been talking about. So what exactly are the lanthanides? The lanthanides are a family of elements that sit in the second to last row of the periodic table of elements. So they're above the actinides. And they're also called 4F materials because the 4F materials, the 4F orbital itself is the last to be filled. In these family of materials, the 5s, 5p, 5d, and 6s orbitals get filled way before the 4F orbital itself. And as such, this transitions from these particular orbitals are very much pure, allowing a spectroscopist like myself to be able to image and collect visible emission with very high purity. And secondly, because this orbital can host as much as 14 electrons, you can get many interesting Coulombic and spin-orbit interactions, allowing you to host states that range from the infrared out to the UV. And lastly, just to harp on the spectroscopic point, these materials are also long-lived lifetime states. The 4F transition is parity forbidden, meaning that they tend to reside in the state for about microseconds to milliseconds, and they're unusually bright. Again, perfect for a spectroscopist to investigate. Now, just to look into the spectra further for these lanthanide series, this is about, I think, 12 of them, but you can see that the energy levels really range from the infrared to the UV, and they're not just one or two, there's many of them. And I think this kind of ties into my PhD a little bit better now. So if you start to pack many of these different lanthanide elements together, you can start to get very interesting physics known as upconversion physics. And upconversion physics was something I've been studying throughout my PhD, and as well as an LRGF residency at Los Alamos. So this is physically what an upconverting nanoparticle is. It is a nanoparticle about 30 nanometers in dimensions. They're ceramic, but they're doped with about 10,000 to about 100,000 of these lanthanide dopants. And this is what really makes upconversion happen. And if you start to look at the upconverting mechanism, what you have is you have a nanoparticle. It absorbs an infrared photon, but because of the long-lived states in the first excited state, it does not relax immediately down to the ground state. Instead, it can absorb another photon from the first excited state to the second excited state, and eventually emit a visible photon of higher energy. Now, as I mentioned that there's about 10,000 to about 100,000 of these lanthanides in a nanoparticle, you can really start to get very complex interactions. Many of them include things like energy transfer upconversion, energy migration, photon-assisted energy transfer, and cross-relaxation. And ultimately, visible emission or higher energy or nonlinear emission is enabled by these dipole-forbidden processes, as well as these anti-Stokes processes enabled by these many different interactions. And lastly, it doesn't really stop there. So there's a lot of efforts in the computational sciences in really predicting the energy level and emission of each different nanoparticle when you start changing their lanthanide concentrations, their dopant types, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of interest in the field in sort of engineering these particles to be next generation emitters, as well as potentially sensors. Now, just to harp on this a little bit more, again, you have a nanoparticle. you hit it with infrared light, but it doesn't just emit back out infrared light. Instead, it upconverts to visible emission in the blue, green, and red, typical of your ytterbium and erbium doped nanoparticles. But throughout most of my PhD, I wasn't just studying upconverting nanoparticles in particular. I was really interested in understanding what exactly happens when really only one or two of these processes start to dominate. This is where we enter a new field of upconversion known as avalanche upconversion. So photon avalanching, what exactly is it? At the heart of it, it can be described in one sentence, where you have a small trigger in your system that leads to large outputs and responses. This can manifest in many natural systems as well, such as nuclear fission and U-235 mass, as well as snow avalanche effects at the top of mountains. And avalanching itself, the mechanism, can also be used to describe things like your avalanching photodiode, the opening of a champagne bottle, as well as your laser when it starts to laze. So what exactly is photon avalanching? So you're getting population inversion due to a chain reaction of cross-relaxation and excited state absorption processes that dominate in this nanoparticle. So if you look at the signature of avalanching in this case, which is the high nonlinearity shown here, there's actually two other criteria, but I won't go into them further. What you have here is that when you start to excite the material with a wavelength that we chose a wavelength that is resonant with the first excited state transition and the second excited state transition, but the ground state to the first state is not resonant. But on the off chance where your material absorbs a photon, it relaxes down to the first excited state, but because the first to second excited state is very resonant and very efficient, it quickly absorbs another photon to the second excited state and sits there. But again, there's 10,000 of these around. So what happens next is you have another ground state ion in the ground state. You can then seed the ground state into the first excited state. And here is where you can sort of see this, I guess, process go down. So two excited states, seed another two ground state to the first excited state, so on and so forth. So eventually you start building up this population of 800 nanometer emitters in the second level, and eventually you run out of ground state ions to excite, and it eventually needs to emit all at once at 800 nanometer energy range. And eventually your material saturates and you start to lose this nonlinearity that we've been talking about earlier. But ultimately what you're getting is you're overcoming a lot of the inherent losses in your system, resulting in efficient upconversion. So photon avalanching is a form of upconversion, just a very efficient one. Now, this is all exciting because for a spectroscopist, we not only get to measure and study lanthanides, we can also use this S-curve as a signature of sensing as well. So if you have a lanthanide ion or a nanoparticle sitting in some, I guess, space, and if you were to perturb it to such a point that the avalanching threshold shifts by like a little bit, what you get is a very large change in your emission in general. So this, and by itself, is a potential, I guess, source of sensing in this material. But a lot of the initial work done on this particle was done in ensembles, and one of my first questions that I had was whether these particles behave as ensembles if you were isolating them into single nanoparticles. So that was my first project, understanding single particle behavior. So when I first spun-cast these nanoparticles onto a substrate and you start imaging them, what's unusually interesting is the fact that they not all turn on at the same time. Additionally, when you look at the S-curves, not all of them avalanche at the same time as well. Some of the hypotheses that I was forming was that the physical heterogeneities and the loss pathways are being accentuated by the avalanching effect. And the experiment is to measure about 300 plus single AMPs to sort of build up a relationship between this hypothesis. Now, single AMPs behave very differently from ensemble AMPs. What's disappointing is the fact that when you're looking at a single AMP, you have a lot less emitters. So your detection efficiency is effectively lower. And we can't really see the bottom half of the S-curve itself. So what we relied on is this DRE model. It's called the differential rate equation model. They're dynamically time-coupled equations allowing us to predict the excited state populations of a generalized three-level system indicative of this avalanching effect. So it looks very complicated, but I'd just like to say that this was just used as a fit to mark the avalanching thresholds and determine the statistics about 300 plus nanoparticles. So just to go back to the hypothesis, we have a nanoparticle. We think it's energy transferring to the environment, to the substrate, to the ligands, and this is all accompanied by the inhomogeneous shell thicknesses that were seen during the synthesis of this material. And we can go into the model a little bit further later, but I can tell you why we look at W2. But in general, we studied 3 batches of nanoparticle. One is the 20% with a shell thickness about 2.6 nanometers, the 8% one with a shell thickness about 5.6, and the 8% 2 with a shell thickness about 8.5. So you can see that across the 3 different batches of nanoparticles, the shell thickness is increasing slowly. Now, when you start to look at the relationship between the three branches, there is a relationship that is starting to show up, and this is very much in line with what chemists have seen earlier, the fact that when you start passivating your shell, your nanoparticle shell with thicker and thicker shells, you tend to get better, I guess, isolation from environmental effects. So this is very much in line with what people have seen, the fact that once you're past 6 nanometers, you're really starting to get very well passivation from environmental effects. But I'd also like to note that when you look at the thinner shell particles, the heterogeneity seen in your shell thicknesses can lead to very large variations in your avalanching thresholds, whereas a very large heterogeneity in your shell thicknesses lead to very small variations in your avalanching thresholds, meaning that your shell thickness plays a much larger role than what we had thought earlier in these avalanching nanoparticles at least, because they're so sensitive. So this is just to wrap up the first project. I've shown that these nanoparticles are potentially amazing sensors of the chemical and environmental factors. But just to sort of pivot right into the residencies I've been doing at Los Alamos, one of them was to understand whether magneto-optical sensing is possible as well. So magneto-optical sensing, magnetometry, can have many applications in things like GPS. Having a nanoparticle GPS could be potentially ground-changing technology, as well as given the burgeoning interest in quantum technology, using them as potentially quantum bits for memories can be potentially useful as well. So for most of my residency, I was studying AMPs under magnetic field, but if you sort of take a step back, this study ended up being very challenging, and I can sort of go into the details as to why. But first, let's go into some of the background. So lanthanides. Lanthanides are oftentimes used as dopants in your rare earth magnets, and they're often very effective. And in the past, people have also shown that erbium in particular can have very sensitive, I guess, transitions to your magnetic fields. This is just all to say that there's large motivations to push these materials as next generation magneto-optical sensors. And at Lano, I was tasked with building up a beamline in our mentor's lab so that I can sort of study these materials under a biased magnetic field, cryogenic conditions, and under intense laser radiation. Now, if you sort of go back a step, you can see that the need for this project can really get a little bit out of hand, but I can sort of highlight this real quickly. One of them is we need a microscopy setup with high NA optics. High numerical aperture allows us to collect grazing angle emission. Collecting all the photons emitted from this nanoparticle is actually very important. We need an attocube stage, allowing us to position the sample such that we're getting a tight focus and there's no deviation from the focus spot itself. Additionally, cryogenic conditions, using this and putting this inside a liquid helium cryostat, allowing us to access the paramagnetic behavior of these lanthanides, in particular thulium, and put this in a magnet that can have up to 7 Tesla in field, allowing us to sort of recreate the studies that were done with erbium. And last but not least, sensitive photon detection with a PMTA and acton spectrometer, as I've said, to collect every single photon. So throughout my time at Lano, I was tasked with sort of working with our mentors to purchase an attocube station, attocube setup, and then I custom fit that to a sample holder that then went inside this Oxford spectromagnet. And on the side, I was constructing a little bit of a beamline, a microscope, to sort of probe and directly collect photons emitted from this material. But eventually, what I came to, I guess some of the first measurements of this material is that it's really hard to say whether there's actually signatures of magnetodependence. Right now, we're still trying to work on disentangling effects from like vibrations, I guess vibrations from your attocube stage, as well as vibrations from your vacuum pump, and sort of understanding what exactly is the source of noise and whether we can still push this system down to have more, I guess, stable environmental connections to collect this emission from this AMPs. So as of right now, this project is very much backburned a little bit, but even though the project didn't really pan out as I'd hoped, I was able to sort of get involved with many other projects at Lano as well through my mentors group, also enabled by this LRGF fellowship. I was able to participate in many other projects like ultrafast spectroscopy of magnon phonons and 2D magnets, work in the clean room and fabricating dielectric and plasmonic metamaterials to sort of tailor these nanomaterials emission with an artificial structure, performing more nonlinear optics, but nonlinear optics with spin. And then last but not least, taking some of the materials that my mentor was studying back to Columbia University so that I can sort of lead collaborations of my own. So I'd like to say that I've been involved with many different projects and that it's been a very enriching moment for me to participate in 3 residencies. So last but not least, one other project that I got involved with at school was to understand whether these AMPs can have other applications as well. One of the more interesting observations that we've seen was that when you compare these to canonical upconverting nanoparticles are known for their I guess, photostability. They don't blink and they don't photobleach. And compared to other, I guess, dyes that people use for bioimaging, they tend to bleach and degrade pretty rapidly, but not these nanoparticles. But in AMPs, the avalanche nanoparticles, what we see is that after some amount of laser radiation, after some amount of time, the particle starts to just turn off, which is unusual for this material of this sort. And when you start to look at the S curve of this material in the on state compared to the off state, you can see that the S curve pretty much varies drastically, and the off state has more or less 5 times in optical losses in the off state. And when you look at the ground state transition, in particular using fluorescent lifetime measurements, you can see that the lifetimes are also very much different as well, meaning that there's some interesting physics happening at the nanoscale. So what we think is in this particular case is that when people synthesize these nanoparticles, there's a lot of, I guess, defects that kind of make their way into the core shell interface. And this core shell interface, I think, is what exactly is going on. The color center or defects is in fact quenching a lot of the emission from the lanthanide ions. But because the AMPs, as I mentioned, are really sensitive, the fact that even small defects can start to quench large amounts of emissions means that these nanoparticles are very sensitive to any kind of defects at the center as well. So this is one of the hypotheses we think is responsible for the photo switching effect we're seeing. And when you sort of turn them off, this is a single nanoparticle as opposed to an ensemble, you can also magically turn them on again, which is also unusual. So this observation that we can hit it with intense CW1064 laser, when it's all off, you can hit it again with 400 to 840 nanometer visible emission, they all turn on again. So this can start to seed, I guess, thoughts into where this might have useful applications. And if you sort of repeat this over 100 different particles, you can see that the behavior more or less stays the same. And additionally, the photo switching robustness that we see in this nanoparticle really holds for about 1,000 cycles, meaning that the quality of this material doesn't really degrade when you're cycling them about 1,000 times. So you can already start to see some of the application areas of this, and one of them is towards optical memories. One of the things you can do is to have a thick film of these nanoparticles, turn them all off with a 1064 beam, turn them on again with a pattern of your choice, turn them off again, and turn them on again. So this can potentially be used in many, I guess, optical memories. I'm not sure what the landscape is in optical memory technology, but again, another interesting application of these AMP materials. But I'd just like to say that, again, see the thought that avalanche nanoparticles are interesting, and the physics don't really end there. Since the discovery in 2021 by our group, we have sort of seen a lot of interesting, I guess, development from the community around us. So people have shown that you can use other lanthanide dopants, praseodymium, to achieve avalanching. Instead of performing UV or E-beam lithography on your chip, you can potentially use near IR light to image and to photo pattern your photoresists. Next, folks in our lab have shown these nanoparticles to be very sensitive pressure-wise down to the piconewtons force, allowing them to potentially be inserted into a cell to measure their dynamics and pressure dynamics inside a living cell. And last but not least, sort of coupling them to other quantum emitters, sort of imprinting their avalanching effect to quantum dots as well. So there's a lot of interesting physics, and more it can be discovered at this rate, and yeah, it's very ripe for future projects. And last, and an acknowledgement. So before I end my talk, I also like to really acknowledge a lot of the fantastic people that made a lot of my time at LRGF, at Lano, and at Columbia very enriching. My advisor, Jim Shuck, for being such a fantastic mentor. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, in particular Emory, for providing a lot of the fantastic samples, nanoparticle samples I've been studying. And Los Alamos National Laboratory for really dealing with me for the past 3 residencies, but also learning a lot from them as well. And just in line with what fellows have been, I guess, doing throughout their presentations, I'd like to update everyone and say that I'll be spending a year-long visiting researcher appointment in Ghent University in Ghent, Belgium. So in addition to partaking and enjoying the scenic canals and partaking in, I guess, the holy trinity of Belgian cuisine, which is chocolate, fries, and beer, and I'll also be working in the photonics research group in Ghent. So I can potentially work on turning these semiconducting 2D materials that are near and dear to my heart during my PhD studies, into next-generation pixel sensors, chiral detectors, as well as understand their role in photonic integrated circuits. So with that, thank you all, and I'll be happy to take questions.